For many years, C.S. Lewis has been, really for decades, C.S. Lewis has been widely thought of as one of the greatest theologians the world has ever seen. You might be familiar with C.S. Lewis. He put together some masterful works during his lifetime, things like the Chronicles of Narnia, the Screwtape Letters, and maybe one of his more famous is Mere Christianity, among several other books and works. But like every Christian, Lewis lived a portion of his life where he didn't have Christ, a portion of his life without Christ. He was not saved. In fact, for many years, Lewis wanted little or nothing to do with Christ at all. It was in these years that Lewis began searching for what might bring him joy. And he experienced joy at some part of his life, like many of us have. And so experiencing it, he knew like that's something that we're going to long for. And it's something that he longed for. And it's something he wanted to experience again. So he started chasing after these things. He wanted to experience that same joy. So he began searching for that joy. He outlined this search that he had in a book titled Surprised by Joy, The Shape of My Early Life. It's an autobiography on Lewis. And referring to that book, Timothy Keller notes this in a sermon. He says, before Lewis was a Christian, he was always trying to find joy in the things, in other things. And before he became a Christian, he binged on things that gave him joy. So the first time Lewis read an Icelandic saga, he loved it. So he doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop at the one book and think that's pretty good. He began reading every Icelandic saga he could find. And once he had read all of those, he decided, okay, let's go a little deeper. So he learns Norse so he could read it in the original language. But he works through all this, and Lewis comes to realize that it isn't paying off as he had hoped it would. So he decides, I'm going to turn elsewhere. I'm going to look for joy elsewhere. And so he decides, I'm going to get a friend. And so he starts binging on this friend, like he's putting all of his time and effort on this friend. Now, how many of you know what happens when you start doing that to other people? Like you kind of, those people kind of get freaked out, right? I mean, you got people that might be binging on you and like pouring all their time and their efforts into you. And so like you got to back away a little bit. I got to get my space. And so that's what happened with Lewis. Lewis was spending all of his time binging on this friend, and this friend eventually begins to back off. I'm sure in similar fashion to our lives, Lewis began seeking joy in the things of this life. And I'm sure after the friend, he began looking for other things. It's a pursuit that's really quite common to this world and has been from the beginning. Of all the biblical characters that we speak of, I think Solomon might present the most detailed portrayal of the pursuit of this joy and satisfaction that we often desire in our lives. If you want to, you can go back and read Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and 2. But in that, really Solomon outlines what all he began searching for, what all he began pouring his life into. And we might use that same word that Lewis used, that he began binging towards in order to find joy and satisfaction. All the things of this life, yet like C.S. Lewis, Solomon, even though he withheld nothing from his pleasure, he didn't hold back at all, never found anything that would give him lasting joy. He continually came up empty. You see, we live in a world that is still walking through those same avenues today, trying to find joy. And as Christians, sometimes influenced by the world, we go wandering down those old familiar paths as well, seeking to find joy ourselves, looking for it really in all the wrong places. And maybe the places themselves aren't really that bad. They're not sinful places. Some of them really are wonderful things. Still yet, they fall short again and again and again. Even so, it's still a natural desire in our lives, is it not, to try to find joy? I might even say that I think it's an implanted desire that we have in our hearts. For 10 weeks now, we've been walking through this series titled Shackled, Paul's letter to the Philippians. And as we've gone throughout this series, throughout this letter, this Philippian letter, we have seen this idea of joy popping up again and again. We haven't really focused on it up to this point. We've kind of just passed by it each time, maybe mentioning it in passing. But we've seen it again and again. In fact, we've seen it so many times. In Philippians, there's only 104 verses throughout the entire book of Philippians. Yet within 104 verses, this idea, Paul uses this Greek word for joy or rejoice, 16 times. You might say that's a theme that runs throughout the book. In fact, many people have seen it as a theme so much that this Philippian letter has gotten the nickname of the letter of joy or something along those lines. And yet again today, as we walk through this passage, we see this idea pop up once more. He says this in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. He says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice." Thus far in this letter, Paul has spoken of praying for the Philippian church with joy. There's different areas of where he talks about joy. He said, "I'm praying for you with joy." He talks about how he rejoices that Christ is being proclaimed, even though it's from the wrong motives. Like he said, I'm excited that the gospel is being proclaimed. These people might be doing it from a bad motive, but hey, people are learning about the Lord. He says he has joy when believers are unified, as he talks about in Philippians chapter 2. And then he goes on to say, he said, even if I'm being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice. In other words, even though I'm having to suffer here, hey, if it's benefiting you, if it's causing you to be built up in Christ, I'm happy about it. I'm joyful about it. I'm rejoicing about it. Time and time again, Paul talks about this idea of joy and rejoicing. And considering where Paul is while writing this letter, it's truly a remarkable thing that he's even able to write about this. We've stated several times in this series where Paul is at, but really it's worth noting again here. Paul's currently sitting in a first century form of house arrest. He's sitting in a home, and even though there's people there, Epaphroditus is there with him, and people can come and go, friends can come and go as they please. Even then, there's really no sense of freedom for Paul. Because Paul sits here in a Roman form of house arrest, it means I'm chained to a Roman guard at all times. And while he may convert a Roman guard here or there, Paul had a knack for relaying the gospel in such a way that people are like, okay, I've got to believe in this. Even though some of them may have converted, most of them, I imagine, probably remain loyal to the emperor. That means that when fellow Christians have to leave, like they got to go back to their own homes, Paul is sitting there most of the time with the most ruthless and careless group of people the world has ever known. These are less than desirable circumstances. I don't think any of us are just saying, give me that vacation, right? None of us want to go to this situation. Like, we don't want that in our lives. Yet, even in the midst of this environment, Paul gives this command. Keep in mind that anytime Paul gives a command, it's not just something he's saying is good for you. Paul's saying it's something that's good for me. It's not just something that he is saying you should do. Paul is giving a command that he has already done. He would never give a command that he did not first believe and follow himself. So get this, Paul is living in joy while sitting in shackles in the face of persecution. And so he gives this command, sitting chained up to a Roman soldier, he gives this command, rejoice in the Lord always. And then in case you didn't get it, Paul says, again, I will say, rejoice. In other words, hey guys, I want to emphasize this point to you right now, because this is quite important. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Now, we've heard this command, I'm sure, at different times in our lives, or someone's told us to rejoice or have joy. But what does this command really mean? And how can we have joy when the circumstances shout everything but joy? I think the answer is found in the word itself. The Greek word for rejoice here is kairo. Kairo in the Greek. But its root comes from a word kar, which basically means favorably disposed or leaning towards. I found that kind of interesting because like Lewis and like Solomon, we are all leaning towards something, and every other human really that's ever existed, we're all leaning towards something, aren't we? Every one of us in here are leaning towards something. Solomon leaned towards everything this world could offer. Lewis leaned towards Icelandic saga and Friends and other things that we haven't mentioned. We're all leaning towards something or someone, seeking to find joy in that place. And of all the things Paul could have chosen to say, hey, rejoice, Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. In other words, lean towards the Lord always. Rejoice in the Lord always. He doesn't say, notice this morning, he doesn't say rejoice in your circumstances, does he? Paul doesn't say, I'm rejoicing in the fact that I'm chained up to a Roman guard. It's not something we'd be excited about. He says rejoice in the Lord. He doesn't say rejoice in your circumstances. He doesn't say rejoice in your job. He doesn't say rejoice in your raise or your promotion. He doesn't say to rejoice in your marriage or your children or in a hobby. And get this, Paul never says rejoice in Kentucky Wildcats. Some of y'all, not me, a Tennessee fan, we don't know what joy is in Tennessee, but some of y'all are trying to find joy in the Kentucky Wildcats. Paul doesn't say find joy anywhere on this earth, does he? He doesn't tell us to rejoice in these places, because while these things may give us joy from time to time, in 2012, y'all found some joy when you won the national championship. Not been that much here since then, has it? It's been since '98 for us, so it's okay. Anyways, these places don't offer us joy. I mean, they might for a while, but not for very long. Notice also it doesn't say rejoice in your wife or your husband. Rejoice in your children, your grandchildren, your grandparents, whoever it may be, your parents. Because while these places may give us some joy from time to time, eventually, like everything else, people let us down. So Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. Lean towards the Lord. Because if we're looking for a constant source of joy, it is the Lord. After all, He never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And while all these sources may fail us, the Lord never will. So we can always find joy in Him. We can lean towards Him. And as Paul commanded us earlier in this letter, we focus on a relationship with God. Because get this, true and legitimate joy is only found through a relationship with Jesus Christ. We try to find joy in relationships in our lives, things in our lives, but true and legitimate joy is only found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. And really that's where Paul found his joy. That's why Paul, sitting here in Roman chains, sitting here chained up to a Roman guard, is able to say, rejoice in the Lord always. Because Paul had developed this deep relationship with Jesus. Paul had developed a lifestyle that continually leaned towards Jesus, that relied on God's grace and love. And as it was stated by Paul's character in the movie, we watched the movie Paul the Apostle of Christ this past Wednesday night. And as he states in here, I think it's true in the movie, I think it was true of Paul's life. Paul knew the one in whom he believed, and he knew the joy of where he was going. Paul knew that Christ held all things, knows all things, is in control of all things. And he knew that on the other end of this temporary pain, the other end of this temporary sorrow or grief that we may be going through today, Paul knew that on the other side of that is joy. And the promise of our eventual eternal joy found in heaven. So Paul rejoices. And he implores the Philippian church to do the same. He implores them to look beyond the present and see what is to come, to lean not into this life and the things of this life, but to lean toward the Lord, to lean into the Lord, depending on God's grace and love for our every need. It's in this that we find joy. It's in our salvation and our growing relationship with the Lord that we find joy. Because the closer we are to Jesus, the more joy we find. If you need an example this morning, I want to challenge you. Think of the people that you know who are walking closest to the Lord. Think of the holiest maybe. Think of the person who walks closest to the Lord in your life. How joyful are they? How joyful are they? Because even while circumstances and situations change, I imagine that their hope and their joy remain the same. Yeah, sometimes you can see that things are hitting them in life, but their joy is not lost because they're walking close to God. And He remains by their side. So Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Now with that said, there are certain things in life that try to steal our joy, is there not? And quite frankly, the more joyful we become, I think the more Satan attempts to rob us of those things. And so Paul continues in this passage and really kind of addresses two of the many issues that I believe rob us of our joy. He says this first of all in Philippians 4 verse 5. Again, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Now, we won't spend much time here today because this has to do with relationships and how we approach our relationships. And throughout this series, really, we've spent several sermons on that, talking about our relationships and approaching people the right way. But Paul speaks, just for a second, we're going to talk about it. Paul speaks about being reasonable or having a gentle spirit. And while we won't focus on it this morning, we ought to know that having a reasonable or gentle spirit will produce more joy in our lives. After all, the opposite of reasonableness and gentleness is an attitude of being callous or hateful or irritable. I mean, while you can think of someone who you know who's closest to Christ, it may be hard to picture that one person, but you can certainly picture some people who are callous and irritable and harsh and hateful people, can't you? I mean, it's kind of the picture, Ebenezer Scrooge before all the dreams, right? There's not much joy found there, is there? Kind of get this gruff face on there's no joy found in a hateful spirit. We know that. When we get irritable or hateful or upset about whatever, there's not much joy found in that. So that attitude is really a joy robber. So Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Be reasonable. Be gentle. The Lord is at hand. That basically means, hey, the Lord is going to return soon. And even if the Lord doesn't return soon in our own lifetimes, then from dust we were made and to dust we will return. One of those two things is going to happen. And that may happen sooner than we imagine. So it says, hey, rejoice in the Lord always. Be reasonable. Be gentle. But in the next verse, in light of rejoicing in the Lord, Paul gives us another area where we often struggle with joy. Paul says this in Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Paul commands us in verse 4 to rejoice in the Lord always. Again, he says rejoice. And I don't think that it's any accident or just a coincidence that he quickly mentions anxiety and the command to not be anxious. Because anxiety is quite possibly the greatest thief of joy we've ever experienced. The greatest thief of joy we'll ever find. And it's certainly an issue that I think affects most everyone. To use the expression, I'm not really a betting man, but if I had to bet, I would bet that everyone in here has experienced anxiety at some point in their lives. Maybe you're feeling a little anxious this morning. And if so, we know how hard it is to be joyful when we're anxious, don't we? I mean, how many of you, when you're anxious, are just joyful as all get out? You know, there's a picture of what rejoice means. That they pictured the little lamb that's just kind of skipping throughout the field. I mean, none of us are just kind of skipping, going through life when we're anxious, are we? None of us. It's hard to have joy when we're filled with anxiety. Now, to be sure, Paul says, be anxious about nothing. Don't be anxious about anything. There is a good kind of anxious, isn't there, that we might be fueled by, that might really kind of fuel our joy. We might be anxious to see someone, maybe coming up on the holidays, you're anxious to see family. We might be anxious to spend time with family and friends. We might be anxious to get to church and worship and fellowship with our Christian family. That type of anxious isn't so much worry or fretting. It's more of an excitement or an expectation of what's to come. Like there's nothing bad in being excited about what's to come. But that's not the kind of anxious that Paul is discussing here. Paul is talking about a type of anxiety that strangles joy, that places a burden on our shoulders, that adds grief to our hearts and our minds. The word here, it kind of draws this picture of the idea of being drawn in different directions. So kind of being like your arms are stretched out and you're being pulled on each side. That's causing us really to be torn and pulled by both sides. And the anxiety that Paul is talking about is something that rips us out of all joy. It's kind of we're yanked back and forth as the object of some form of tug of war. Hope on one side and yet fear and anxiety and dread on the other. And chances are, whenever we've been anxious about something, this is exactly how we felt. Like we were being torn from both sides, as though we're being pulled apart from within. It appears that that's what's happening in the church in Philippi. The fact that Paul makes this command shows us that it's quite likely that the church is struggling with this issue. And as we read this letter from our human perspective, we see that the church in Philippi would have had plenty to be anxious about. I mean, consider what Paul talks about. Consider what's going on here in Philippi. First of all, the church had conflict. Paul begins addressing that in chapter 2. It gets a little closer to home at the beginning of chapter 4. We've got two women who are fighting it out. Conflict can certainly cause anxious minds, can it not? Even if you're not in the middle of conflict and you know two people you love that are in conflict, it makes you a little bit anxious sometimes, doesn't it? And so they got conflict. They don't only have conflict within the church, they got conflict coming from outside the church. There's pressure from outside, from all sides, really, attacking the church. Paul spoke of this in chapter 1. He's telling the church to not be frightened in anything by your opponents. That shows that they have opponents to the gospel. And when Paul left the city, Christianity wasn't really received well, was it? Go back and read Acts chapter 16. Paul was basically forced out of the city. So since then, you can't really imagine that Christianity has really been accepted within the city of Philippi. They're feeling pressure from the outside. And then beyond that, there's also their concern for Paul. Their concern for someone they love. They love Paul dearly, as did at least most of the people in the churches that he witnessed to. And knowing that Paul is in shackles, and knowing that there's a trial awaiting him, and knowing that there's no telling what's going to happen to him, like death could be, in their minds, they don't know yet, but death could be on the end of this trial. They've got to be anxious about Paul, about the verdict that Paul's going to receive. Of course, this list is only a small list. It's likely longer and deeper than just those things. And we can imagine many more reasons that they may have to be anxious just by examining our own lives, can't we? There's anxiety over many things. I mean, we have anxiety over bills, anxiety over our work, anxiety over our relationships, anxiety over health, anxiety over the direction of the country, anxiety over school, anxiety over our parents, our grandparents, our children and grandchildren. And with Christmas fast approaching, anxiety seems to run through more and more people this time of year. You got the anxiety of how am I going to make it work to buy all the presents, and how am I going to make sure I get the right presents, and all these different things. How are we going to make it work going from one place to another? In a fallen world, the reasons for anxiety are endless. And yet Paul says, don't be anxious about anything. More literally, he says, be anxious about nothing, emphasizing the word nothing. In fact, in the Greek, when you look at the Greek, nothing is placed at the very beginning of the sentence. So like in English, if we were to translate it word by word, it would be nothing, be anxious. Paul's emphasized, don't be anxious about anything. Be anxious about nothing, not one thing. Sounds pretty wonderful, doesn't it? I mean, how many of us want to be anxious about nothing? About every one of us, I'd say. But if I had to imagine, there's probably a small part of us, or maybe there's a thundering voice that's shouting, that is impossible. You hear it? Paul says be anxious about nothing. There's something within us sometimes that says there's no way I can be anxious about nothing. And yet Paul wouldn't give this command if it was impossible. So there must be a way. And Paul shows us. You see, Paul didn't just say to us, hey, be anxious about nothing and leave it at that. He didn't just say that and go on with the rest of his letter. If so, we would walk around saying, stop worrying, stop worrying. How often does that work? When you tell yourself, you need to stop doing this. A lot of times it adds fuel to the fire, doesn't it? Instead, Paul shows us what to do, and it's something Paul has certainly done in his own life. Understand, this isn't just a preacher telling you the right things to say, all right? This isn't just a preacher saying, this is what I need to be telling you. This is Paul who says, I have experienced this in my own life. I know how to be anxious about nothing. So Paul says, in everything, my prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Paul says, you want joy in your life? You want to stop worrying, you want to stop fretting, you want to stop being anxious all of the time, then here's what you do. Start by making your request known to God. Go to God with prayer and supplication and thanksgiving and everything. That's how Paul found an anxiety-free life. That in everything but prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, he let his request be made known to God. Now, what does all this mean? I love the way Ray Stedman explains this verse. Whenever problems develop, lean back, or to go back to what we said earlier, lean toward the Lord again in prayer, to the one who is able and competent within you through His indwelling life. And thanksgiving is that forward look of faith that thanks God for the answer before you even see it. Pray. Pray. Keep going back with thanksgiving in the heart. And I want you to notice a key word here in verse 6. We find the word everything. In everything. Nothing is too big and nothing is too small to approach God about it. I've had people in my life that have reached out to me and said, I know it's not a very big deal, but I ask you, would you pray for this? It's not a big thing. And I've had other people think, you know what, I really don't want to bother God with this small issue in my life. I'll just try to take care of it myself. It's as if we kind of think this way, and we think God doesn't have time for what I'm dealing with, for this little thing that's going on in my life. It's a good thing God's omnipresent, isn't it? That He's everywhere all the time. It's a good thing that He's all-powerful. Because the fact that God is all-powerful, all present everywhere all the time, the fact that He is sovereign over everything means God can handle the big stuff at the same time that He's handling the little stuff. Which means we can approach God about it. In fact, not just we can approach God about it, God invites us to approach Him about it. Peter says this in 1 Peter 5, verse 7. Cast all anxieties on Him because He cares for you. Cast all your anxieties on Him because He cares for you. God wants us to offer all of our anxieties up to Him in prayer. Because understand, when we do this, we stop focusing on everything that's spinning out of control, and we start focusing on the one who is in control. When we do this, we stop focusing on the size of the problem that's causing our anxiety, and we begin focusing on the ability of our God to work in the problem. We stop focusing on the issue, and we start focusing on the one who has solved our greatest issue, salvation. And if God can fix that, He can do anything. So Paul tells us, rejoice in the Lord always. Take all your anxieties to God in prayer. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I'll say rejoice. And as we continually do this, as we grow closer in fellowship and relationship with God, an amazing thing happens. Look at verse 7. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Check that out. When we go to God in prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, and let our requests be made unto Him, God gives us peace. It's a God-given peace. It's a peace that the world cannot offer. And the world cannot offer because it's a peace the world cannot even conceive. It's a peace that can only come from God. Now, I do want to stop here just for a moment this morning and address this. The problem with our interpretation of this verse is that we often think that it's some kind of formula. Like if I just do one prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, if I just do it one time, then I'm going to find the peace of God. Like we get on our knees and we pray, we offer it up to God, and we stand up and say, well, that didn't work. And so then we start thinking, well, the Word of God's lying. Or maybe it works for other people, but it doesn't work for me. Understand, that's not what this verse is saying at all. It's not what the verse is saying.